There's a fascinating story in the Old Testament, and the central character of the story is a guy called Nehemiah. Over 70 years before Nehemiah, Israel had been run over by the Babylonian Empire, and as a result, the kingdom of Judah was destroyed, and 3 million Israelites were carried off into captivity. And then when the Babylonian Empire went into decline, it was overrun by the Persian Empire. And after about 70 years as captives, the Israelites were freed by the first Persian emperor called Cyrus. But only a handful of the millions of Jews that went off into captivity returned, maybe 30,000. The rest stayed and integrated in their Persian society. And Nehemiah was a descendant of those exiled Israelites. At the point that we meet him in the book of the Bible that bears his name, he's a cupbearer to the Emperor Artaxerxes. And on one of the days when he brought the wine to Artaxerxes, the king realized that his cupbearer was not his usual upbeat self, because Nehemiah had received news about his homeland, about how it was in ruins and everything. And for some reason, this exile, who had never even been to his homeland, his heart was broken for those people. Nehemiah explained to the king, after the king asked him why he was not feeling upbeat, about what he explained to the king the reason why he was downcast. And so the king gave Nehemiah permission to return to his homeland. He sent him with letters granting him permission to build the walls. And so with these letters in hand, this guy who was born in exile returned to his homeland and spearheaded a rebuilding process of the walls of the city in 52 days. 52 days. As you can imagine, this effort didn't go smoothly. I mean, we're people after all. He faced much opposition from the people who were benefiting from the fact that the city was in ruins. And his two main opposers were gentlemen, if you can call them gentlemen, by the names Sanballat and Tobiah. And they did everything in their power to undermine their work and threaten him. Sanballat and Tobiah and their buddies started out as every bully does. They ridiculed and insulted the workers. They told them they'd never get the work done. They made fun of the wall, and they said that if a fox climbed up the wall, it would collapse. But this did not deter Nehemiah and the guys building the wall. They just prayed and kept on working. So, just like every bully that is ignored, Sanballat and Tobiah worked themselves up and decided to go cause a fracas and stir up trouble and fight the Israelites. You can practically see them in a seedy part of the city getting inebriated and working themselves up. Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. But before they could carry out their plan, word got to Nehemiah, and he came up with a pretty interesting solution. Let's read the story. Nehemiah 4. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repairs of the walls of Jerusalem were going so well, that the breaks in the wall were being fixed, they were absolutely furious. They put their heads together and decided to fight against Jerusalem and create as much trouble as they could. This is Nehemiah talking about him and his friends, we countered with prayer to our God and set around-the-clock guard against them. But soon word was going around in Judah, the builders are pooped, the rubbish piles up, we're in over our heads, we can't build this wall. And all this time our enemies were saying, they won't know what hit them. Before they know it, we'll be at their throats, killing them left and right. That'll put a stop to the work. The Jews who were their neighbors kept reporting, they have us surrounded. They're going to attack. If we heard it once, we heard it 10 times. So I stationed armed guards at the most vulnerable places of the wall and assigned people by families with their swords, lances, and bows. After looking things over, I stood up and spoke to the nobles, officials, and everybody else. Don't be afraid of them. Put your minds on the master, great and awesome, and then fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Our enemies learned that we knew all about their plan and that God had frustrated it. And we went back to the wall and went to work. From then on, half of my young men worked while the other half stood guard with lances, shields, bows, mail armor. Military officers served as backup for everyone in Judah who was at work for building the wall. The common laborers held a tool in one hand and a spear in the other. Each of the builders had a sword strapped to his side as he worked, and I kept the trumpeter at my side to sound the alert. Then I spoke to the nobles and officials and everyone else. There's a lot of work going on, and we're spread out across the wall, separated for each other. So when you hear the trumpet call, join us there. Our God will fight for us. And so we kept working from first light until the stars came out, half of us holding lances. I also instructed the people, each person and his helper is to stay inside Jerusalem, guards by night and workmen by day. We all slept in our clothes. I, my brothers, my workmen, and the guards backing me up. And each one kept his spear in hand, even when getting water. I visited the story of Nehemiah many times over my life. There is much to learn from Nehemiah about leadership. But parallel to his incredible exploits as a leader is a narrative that is so easy to miss. You see, the Israelites were a conquered people. In fact, this city that they were rebuilding was at the time a province of the Persian Empire. They'd been a conquered people for over 70 years to this point, and knowing how long it took them to get over their slavery in Egypt, you can imagine how difficult a task it must have been for some foreigner to gather a bunch of conquered people and focus them enough to build a wall for 52 days, in 52 days. The narrative parallel to Nehemiah's leadership genius is the story of a bunch of underdogs doing something that would have been considered impossible at the outset. If you read the story of Nehemiah, you come to realize that even after they built the wall, it was not smooth sailing. But in spite of this, you have to admit that against all odds and against the opposition and against the threats and everything, it's pretty remarkable that they came to build the walls of a city in under 3 months. This is the second week of our talking about missing pieces. And yes, on this Thanksgiving Sunday, I could have just preached some generic sermon about being thankful, but I decided not to go there. If you missed last Sunday's message, I talked about the fact that I'm not a prototypical pastor. I spoke as honestly as I could about the fact that while I'm genuinely thankful and grateful for the opportunity to provide leadership at Pivot 613, my primary gifting is not as a pastor, but as a prophet. And this week, I was going to plow right through and keep going and talk about apostleship from the passage of Ephesians that we read last week. But I decided that I would just pull the handbrake just a little bit and this Thanksgiving just talk about a preliminary idea before we go into apostleship. Have any of you ever been on a cruise ship? I've never been on a cruise ship, but I have friends who have. And cruise ships, as we know, are these giant floating hotels. And the ones that they're putting out these days are just insane. They're huge. My friends who love going on cruises always come back with some pretty cool stories of where they went, the countries they went to, the food that they ate, the things that they did on the ship and whatever. The one thing they never talk about on the cruise is how hard they had to work. The cruise is not about hard work. No. It's about relaxation and partying and sun and tourism. The work is for the staff. You know, those invisible staff that scurry around and somehow clean your room without you knowing, and cook and pilot the ship and unload and load and make your stay effortless. And if you think about it, most churches operate like cruise ships. Things just work. And people going never realize how they work. Everything that goes into making your experience happen is just like magic. You never have to think about who cleans because the washrooms are always clean, the carpet is always vacuumed. The website is always updated. The weekly email always arrives like magic. Every time someone picks up a microphone, it works. It's actually a big deal because we've all been to places where it's like, boom, 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 boom. Is it on? Is it on? What's going on? We don't have that. If you're not involved with the nuts and bolts of your congregation, it is very easy to fall into the trap of consuming church the same way that you would consume things on a cruise. Now, is this harsh? Yeah. Is it true? Unfortunately, it is. 6 weeks ago, we talked about the vision of Pivot 613, writing new histories through love and grace and mercy. 5 weeks ago, we talked about the opportunities that Pivot 613 has to engage our city and the emerging culture that's coming as a result of postmodernism. Following that, we talked about our take on creativity and then on diversity and all the incredible things that we could do if we embrace these ideals. Every time I talk about the 2020 of Pivot 613, I get super energized because it is such a compelling picture to me. We exist to lead people to a growing relationship with Christ, transformed by grace and mercy and love. But here's the thing, we'll never really get there as a cruise ship, will we? For all the marvel of these sea hotels, they are very limited vessels. They cannot travel very far without having to dock, without having to change staff, without having to load up on food, without having to recharge the propulsion systems. And for Pivot 613 to go the distance, we cannot be a cruise ship. It's just not a tenable way to realize our potential. I'll say it again. We cannot be a cruise ship. We have to be, if we're using the image of sea-going vessels, we have to be a submarine. On a submarine, there are no non-essential people. Everybody that's in a submarine can do like 3 or 4 jobs. You cannot gain entrance to a submarine lightly. And more to that, like a submarine never has to even stop for fuel. It generates its own fresh water and oxygen. In fact, submarines can go up to 3 months without ever having to surface. And the only reason they do it is to get food for the crew. A cruise ship, on the other hand, has to dock at least every 3 or 4 days. It can't stay that long in the sea. And as we've seen recently, they capsize so easily. The missions of submarines are very important, and so it affects the kind of people that get to crew them. Submarines have something called all hands on deck. It's an all hands on deck mentality because everybody understands that they're critical to the mission. Everybody from the cook to the sea captain is essential and has more than one job. If you've not already figured it out, Pivot 613 to me is a submarine. I view Pivot 613 like the men and women that we read about in Nehemiah. Pivot 613 is an all-hands-on-deck kind of church. Each one of you is essential to the growth, survival, and advancement of our congregation. You've been conscripted in a submarine crew, and you didn't even know it. Now, I'm a different kind of leader than many leaders you will run into. Most leaders that I know are very good at articulating what jobs need to be done and then ordering people around to do them. They call it delegating. And I'm very good at that. I'm very good at standing around and giving people orders. But a few years ago, I was challenged to lead differently. Instead of leading from the platform as a celebrity, I was challenged to lead as a servant who arrives first, puts in the most amount of work, and leaves last. That's why my wife and I are here as early as we can be, and we stay till everything is done. That's why I've taught myself every single job that needs to be done at Pivot 613. It's not because I'm a control freak. It's because this is an all-hands-on-deck situation. Whatever needs to be done gets done. The mission is critical. This is not a vessel to stand around and get pampered in. This is one in which you work. We are about the critical business of changing the hearts and minds of people where grace and mercy and love are concerned, and our world Ottawa really needs to hear this message. As we were driving down here, looking at all the people on the street, I was praying for them, praying that one day we would have an opportunity to share with these people in Ottawa the transformation of grace and mercy and love. I found that by working harder, or as hard as anybody on my teams, it helps to keep me humble. Even in June and August, most of you know, I was struggling with complications in my lower abdomen. And I asked for help, but that I did not use it as an excuse to pull back. In 2014, after we started, I went through some of the worst symptoms of MS, and those of you that were us then, you remember this. But no matter how hard Jim and Wendy tried to convince me, and other leaders tried to convince me to sit things out, I just couldn't. I'm not on a cruise ship. I'm on a submarine. Like Nehemiah and his guys, we need to build a wall. And even if it means working with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other, we'll do what needs to be done. Even if it means sleeping in our clothes for 3 months. I like that in that passage. They slept in their clothes for 3 months. We'll do whatever it takes. On this Thanksgiving Sunday, I'd like to invite you into a whatever it takes mentality. Let me explain why. Pivot 613 is not a cruise ship. As we sit here in this room, everything that has led up to this moment where you are listening to me speak has involved hours of preparation and tens of thousands of dollars. But there is never a moment where I've considered it to be a burden. And do you know why? It is my absolute privilege to share with you, one more way in which grace and mercy and love, the grace and mercy and love of Christ, can create a radically different story for your life. This is the why. This is our why. The time that has been given as a sacrifice, obviously, the dollars that have been spent have been received out of the generosity of you and so many people that you'll never get to meet. Pivot 613 could never survive on the efforts of a few, but rather on the hard work of many committed people. Now, I know it may not seem like a big deal when it's just a handful of us sitting here in this room, but it really is. Our story will never be about the triumph of an individual's dream. No. It is an emerging story, an ever-emerging story of a group of misfits that God is calling and transforming by His grace. We did not get here by being a cruise ship. We will not get where we want to go if we turn into one. Now, the last thing that I would want for you to remember about this afternoon is that you came in and Paulo beat you over the head and guilt-tripped you and whatever. But what I hope that you'll hear instead is that I'm extending you an invitation. I found that if you put your hand in God's hand and allow Him to work through you in any capacity, you get a front row seat to some pretty awesome stuff. You look back on your life, and like Nehemiah, you find you've achieved something incredible in 52 days when everybody said it could never happen. And in particular, I'd like to end this afternoon by thanking you guys. There is so much work to be done. But today, Thanksgiving Sunday, I want to say thank you. So many of you are very generous with your finances. And as a result, we're actually ahead of our giving this year than we were at this time last year. This is especially encouraging because our funding is going to reduce by 20% next year. Others of you come early and you help with the setup. Thank you. Others of you continue to work on your family and friends to invite them out. Thank you. Our families bring cookies and cupcakes and brownies to share with us, and it brings more joy to our congregation than you'll ever understand. Others still help out with hospitality and hosting and greeting. I'm incredibly thankful for everything that each one of you does to help us. To be sure, there's still much to be done, but it would be remiss of me to not take a moment to say thank you for however you help us in whatever capacity you do it. You know, as a leader that is flawed and makes numerous mistakes, I have to help you all understand that we would not be here if it was not for you. So Pivot 613 is not a cruise ship. We did not set out to start another consumerist congregation. As a matter of fact, if God blesses us, when he does, and we get to about 100 people, we're going to ask 10 people, 20 people to break off and start it again. We will never be a massive congregation, 500, 600 people meeting together. That's not our vision. We're going to be small congregations all around this city. Part of the reason for that is that we felt God call us very strongly to not build a consumerist church where you have 25 people doing the work for 1,000 people. That's just not a kingdom model. Our hope was that this would be a congregation. Our hope is that this will be a congregation and continue to be one, where everybody is active in the life and sustenance of the group. And the reason I want to challenge you, the reason I will continue to do this in the months to come, is because against all odds, I see in you guys the potential for something great. I see in you the seeds of something so much bigger than us. Like Elijah on the hill when his servant runs up to him and says, I see a cloud the size of a human hand. And Elijah says, get ready, it's going to rain. I see in you guys that potential. And if we can join hands and work together and give more than what is convenient, I think that God can do through us something that we could have never expected. Amen. Amen.